Welcome to all, greetings all. My name is Jacob Mulugeta. I'm an academic based at University College London, working through the Department of Science, Technology, Engineering and Public Policy, specializing in the area of energy and development. I'm also partnership lead of the Climate Compatible Growth Program, which is a program funded by the FCDO to support investment in sustainable energy transport systems to meet development priorities in the global south. The CCG program itself provides research and public goods, and it's there to support countries develop economic strategies, plans, and policies that are compatible to low carbon development. It brings together a series of UK's leading universities and research organizations in alignment with institutions across several countries in Africa and Asia. So let me say a warm welcome to all of you. And really, I mean, this webinar is part of our engagement with the COP for the CCG, and to try and bring build some momentum towards the COP that will be taking place in Egypt. So we will organize a series of side events entitled, we've titled it as Africa, Asia, a just transition to low carbon development. So please expect us to communicate the details of the side events as we move forward. But the key, I mean, today's session, of course, is that we are here to deliberate on the preparation of Africa towards the COP, and really understand what are the key priorities that we ought to discuss in advance of the COP. But let me make just one logistical announcement, if you don't mind, before introducing the theme of the webinar and our speakers. The webinar is being recorded and will be available on CCG website. I hope that's okay with all of you. Is that okay with everyone? No objection? Yeah? Okay. The other thing is, let me ask you also to please prepare your questions while our distinguished guests are discussing, and post your questions in the chat box. And please indicate to whom your questions are addressed. And we will do our very best to get through all of them, and for our panelists to respond to them. Just a little bit of a background. I mean, the COP is described as Africa's COP, and promises to offer the opportunity to articulate Africa's priorities for building transformative adaptation, limiting emissions rise, accessing appropriate finance, and addressing loss and damage. Loss and damage as being a very critical area for the continent. And we know that much has happened, of course, since COP26 at the global stage. That may create hurdles, but also offer opportunities in the negotiations in Egypt, but also beyond that as well. So we are here very privileged to hold this high-level webinar. And we have with us some of the thought leaders and decision makers to help us unpack some of the opportunities and challenges that Africa faces. The breadth and depth of experience of the panelists will bring a variety of perspectives on the issue of development pathways in a climate-constrained world. And what really does this mean for Africa and its people? This webinar will take the form of a moderated conversation with our panelists, our distinguished panelists, and also involvement from all of us participants in this webinar. Now, before diving into the core discussion, allow me to introduce briefly our speakers. So we have Professor Kevin Urama, who's currently acting as Chief Economist, Vice President for Economic Governance and Knowledge Management at the African Development Group. He's also Senior Director of the African Development Institute at the bank, responsible for shaping and leading the bank's capacity development in the regional member countries. Professor Urama recently led the bank's African Economic Outlook on the theme of climate change and just energy transitions. He holds various executive leadership positions in academia, international organizations, and the private sector. I should also say that he was a CLA, that's a coordinating lead author of the IPCC's fifth assessment report. Our second panelist is Dr. Fatima Denton, who's director of the United Nations University Institute for Natural Resources in Africa. She's an accomplished senior leader in the UN system, respected across the research and implementation branch of the organization. A huge depth of expertise in natural resource management, as well as deep knowledge of research and policy development and in the African region. Prior to joining the UN INRA, Dr. Denton worked with the UN Economic Commission for Africa in Ethiopia. Her roles included Director of Natural Resource Management Division and Coordinator of the African Climate Policy Center. And she was my boss at UNECA. Dr. Denton has been coordinating lead author and lead author of the various IPCC assessment reports, including the most recent one. We also have Yamit Dagnet, who is Director for Climate Justice at the Open Society Foundation. She has deep multi-regional expertise on climate justice and experience in private nonprofit as well as public sectors. Prior to joining the Open Society, Yamit served as Director of Climate Negotiations at the World Resources Institute in Washington, D.C., focusing on equitable implementation of Paris Agreement and the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. She has more than 18 years experience in advancing environmental objectives, having worked as UK policy lead and negotiator on the UNFCCC measurement, reporting, and verification framework. Yamid was recently recognized by The Ecologist as one of the top 25 influential women climate leaders. We have also Professor Yuval Sokona, who's a vice chair of the IPCC. Prior to this, Professor Sokona was co-chair of IPCC Working Group 3 on mitigation of climate change for the fifth assessment report, after serving as lead author since the early 1990s. 40 years of experience addressing energy, environment, and sustainable development in Africa. Professor Sokona is a well-known figure and led a number of African flagship programs that include the African Climate Policy Center, and he was my boss at the ACPC as well, and as Executive Secretary of the Sahara and Sahel Observatory. So he cuts across mitigation and adaptation challenges for Africa. Now, and Professor Sokona is affiliated with numerous boards and organizations, including here at University College London. In short, he's a global figure with deep technical knowledge and extensive policy experience. And finally, Professor Mark Howells, who's the CCG program director. He's jointly appointed at Loughborough University and Imperial College. Previous to joining us at the CCG program, Mark was at the Royal Institute of Technology in Sweden, where he set up their prestigious energy systems analysis program. So he's been involved in a wide range of modeling tools for sustainable development policies initiatives, and championed the whole issue of open source modeling. And so it's a privilege to have you, Mark. Just a little bit there. Mark also is a graduate of and have done postgraduate studies at the University of Cape Town in South Africa. So this webinar, as I was saying, will take a kind of moderated conversation, and for the sake of this conversation, we will throw away our titles, and we will address each other on a first name basis. We will wrap up with some concrete takeaways at the end of this session. So welcome everyone, and thank you for those distinguished guests. So let me pass to my first question, and this is to all of us who are involved in this discussion. So you may recall some 10 years ago, Africa hosted the COP27 in Durban, South Africa. You may recall all of us worked on the first Africa Pavilion, where there was a huge amount of optimism as the world recognized the climate crisis as a real existential threat, especially for African countries that were wilting under the weight of climate change. We're now 10 years later. The question is, how far has Africa come? What has been achieved in the past decade of both negotiations, but also climate action in Africa? So this is a fairly broad question. And I would like to start with Kevin, having led the Africa Economic Outlook. What would you say? What have we achieved over the past 10 years, Kevin?
Thank you very much, Jakob, and thank you, colleagues who are on the panel and delegates joining from all over the world. And I want to thank the UCL for organizing this pre-COP seminar. It's very, very timely. The question you asked, Jakob, in a few minutes, I would say Africa as a continent has achieved a lot in terms of meeting commitments on the climate action. We know that since COP21, of course, we had the Durban COP, and now had the COP21, where we had the Paris Agreement that involved development of the NDCs to allow each country of the world to stay within its carbon budget. Africa has done so well in terms of remaining within its carbon budget. Currently, the per capita carbon consumption in Africa is about 0.95%, 0.95 tons of CO2 equivalent, while in other countries, it's like 14 tons. So, and what we have calculated as the average per capita to remain per individual around the world to remain within the global carbon budget to achieve net zero is 2 tons of CO2 equivalent. So in that case, you will see that Africa is doing very well. Africa has remained green, remaining climate resilient, and within the carbon budget of the world. So Africa is not the problem. Then also we look at the NDCs and how it has evolved. And by 2018, 189 members of the Conference of Parties had ratified their NDCs, and 90% of African countries also had done theirs. And in addition to that, African countries have taken very significant steps to continue to maintain the CO2 emissions from the continent at an average of below 3% of the global emissions. So from all these, I can say that African countries are doing very well. The problem is whether the COP in itself and the global climate action is fair and just and doing better with regard to rewarding countries like African countries that has been doing very well. So given that this is just an opening statement, I'll stop here to give other colleagues a chance to chime in, and I can come back on the same question later. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. Africa has done its share. Is the response from Kevin, and still remains within its carbon budget, as it were. Let me turn to Fatima, if to hear your thoughts on this, Fatima, in terms of what has been achieved over the past 10 years. Of course, I mean, you have worked a lot on adaptation issues as well, and to hear your reflections.
Thank you very much, Jakob, and it's lovely to see familiar faces on the screen. So lovely to be part of this. It's nice to be part of this this panel. I don't know if Jakob recalls, but some time ago at the Economic Commission for Africa, we had been slightly worried. I think it was just as we were planning to go to COP21. And there was a slight worry that it was also meant to be a momentous COP, and how Africa steers its way to getting a good deal out of COP21 mattered. So we had worked, I would say, really hard on looking back at climate leadership, climate diplomacy, and trying to understand what is the role that Africa played, and working with the African group of negotiators. And it was quite impressive. So just agreeing with what Kevin said, that there are quite a lot of work that has already gone into this 25 years or 27 years of COP negotiation that Africa can be proud of. But again, I think that it's a little bit beyond what we have achieved to what else do we need to do. I would say, first of all, we can't call this an African COP unless we have an African vision in terms of what exactly do we want to achieve and what is the scale of our ambition. So I think it's very important to go with a very coordinated plan or very coordinated set of issues that we want to debate. And I know that this is what the African group of negotiators does. But I think this time round, we're in a very turbulent world. There are so many things that are happening related to different types of disruptions that we're seeing, and the energy price hike and the anxieties that we're seeing as a result of the Russian-Ukrainian war, the problems related to broken supply chains, the problems related to the residual anxieties, and I would say economic fallout that has come out of managing a pandemic that has left many African economy badly bruised, I think has left us with a litany of problems. So we are essentially talking about a transition without justice. We are talking about a transition without the transitional levers. We're talking about a transition without the preparation that we need. So I think Africa needs to really ask itself, what does it want? What is the scale of its ambition? Because if we believe what energy economists are telling us, that 70 to 80% of the demand for energy will come from the global south, and Africa has a role to play in that demand, then it's an opportunity market for Africa. But do we just want to be a market? You know, are other things important to the continent beyond just being a market, where we are supplying and producing for others to remain clean and to be green, whereas 80% of our populations haven't got the relevant energy infrastructure or energy sources to be able to rise out of this energy poverty that has held us back for so long. So I would say we really need to ask ourselves, what do we want? What's our current context? Because that will define what we want. And how do we, I would say, muster a greater climate leadership? That has been lacking, Jakob. I think since the days of Meles Zenawi, we haven't seen that level of climate leadership yet, even though we have a CAHOS of Committee of African Heads of State. we still do need something that really can rally or can act as a rallying point in terms of the big issues that we have to see how these could be discussed, because others are getting their act together. So I think Africa needs to also follow suit in terms of defining and being uncompromising about the things that matter to its economy and its people. Thank you.
Thank you, Fatima. Complementing what Kevin has highlighted, but also informing us that there are some good things that have happened, but also in some ways there is a certain level of bottlenecks that we're faced with, largely created by the geopolitics and also Africa not able to articulate a common vision, as it were. Let me now turn, Yuba. You've been in this field for the longest time, and you have mentored many of us, of course. But just the past 10 years, what has it represented for you? The opportunities, but also the missed opportunities, if there have been any.
Thank you, Jacob, for inviting me into this conversation on an important topic. After what Kevin and Fatima has said, I don't know anything else can be said. But as I have to speak, in between Durban and Sharm El-Sheikh, there is a COP in Morocco. Obviously, there is a number of progress, but the progress at the level of the ambition that is needed for clearly back to 10 years or maybe before. The policymakers were not interested in climate issues. I remember that at the highest level, at the policymaking level, they said that their interest is on land degradation, desertification, climate is something from the north. And they think that changed. We have seen all the United States in Paris. And this is really important, and they created a CASC. And AMSEN and then the climate negotiator also get together. But it's not important to indicate what have been done, what is missing. One of the fundamental elements, what Fatima indicated, I have not seen, I do not know an African narrative on climate. This is fundamental. It is not a fact that to be part of the negotiation, because the COPs are just, milestones. But what is very important is to have your own narrative. What the narrative, the African narrative, I do not see it. Say that adaptation is important. It's important for Africa. Everyone knows that this is very important for Africa. But how you articulate that in your present and your future, I think that is lacking. In Africa also is one of the few places where I experienced that, and then Fatima experienced it, and I'm sure that also Kevin experiences. There's a lack of connection between policy practice and science, because some mention the CASC. The CASC has some connection with the negotiators, but they have no connection with the IPCC, the science part. There's no formal connection between the climate negotiator and the science part. It looks like the science that is completely, not no interest, no connection. While we have seen during the past 10 years, a number of publications by the scientists on the African try to articulate the perspective and the agenda for Africa. It's through the scientists also that some of the major initiatives that came from Africa, including the African Renewable Energy Initiative, including the African Adaptation Initiative, all those emerged from the scientists. And for the first time, it is not the partners, it is not the multilateral, bilateral who define what is good for Africa. It's the African by themselves define them. But we have not seen also the articulation between that and the policy at the regional or at the national levels. And those are some of the different elements we need. This is not a COP for Africa, the Sharm El-Sheikh, but it should be where we take stock of what are our strengths and then what are the various perspectives, and then we need to put in place. And those are some of the elements I just want to bring in the agenda, because it's easy to say that everything is perfect, everything is good. We have achieved a lot, but we have not yet connected our aspiration development agenda on the climate issues. And I think that is crucial. This is fundamental. Back to you.
Thank you, Yuba. We know that your entry point in this debate is always development. Hence, why the term development first was coined some 10 years ago that you articulated. Let me now turn to Yamid. You've been also in this field for quite a while, both at the policy level, but also in the negotiations. And what Yuba is talking about is there is this disconnect that we're seeing between policy, practice, and knowledge. Is this how you view it? But also, if you could say something about what is it that we are expecting out of this COP in Egypt, realistically speaking.
Thank you very much, and thanks for the opportunity to be here. I am humbled and I feel honored, with this panel, and coming with the lens, from my background, but also from the diaspora, as a daughter of an Afro descent. So, my take, yes, between Durban, there's been Paris, which was hailed as a landmark. And, there's been a lot of emphasis on, how, some countries, especially the US and China, have played a catalytic role, a defining role to shape it. But, it's a usual Northern view. And, I wanted to highlight how, and I think Fatima, mentioned it, that Africa really played a critical role also as a chair of the G77, at a time when we had, very different national interests, for this agreement, which is not just an environmental agreement. It's an economic, social agreement framework as well. You had also Africa as chair of the LDC. So all of these helped shape and bring the justice element into the agreement. Having said that, yes, I think I agree with the assessment of Kevin and Fatima and also Yuba. After Paris, you had Marrakesh. From Marrakesh, you had a number of landmark initiatives for the African continent, especially on energy, on adaptation. And, the approach of donors and the governance challenges, for those initiatives prevented them to fulfill probably their ambition until now. I am hoping that we will see, more outcome on the grounds, and that's going to very much benefit Africa, and there will be more institutional strengthening to make this happen. But sometimes it feels like some missed opportunities when it comes to some areas. Of course, there's been a lot of push to advance some priority issues for developed countries on mitigation, on the development of the rules of the game, especially on transparency. But when it comes to adaptation, loss and damage, there's been much less progress, which has been a priority for the continent. And I would say, unfortunately, worryingly, we are facing, as we head towards COP27, a trust crisis exacerbated, by the notion of double standards and a colonial system especially in the financial system, that needs to be reformed and in a decolonialized way. And we see double standards with some backsliding also when it comes to commitments to reduce emission from the South on their approach to energy. And the lessons learned that they've been given and that they do not follow through. So this is creating a trust and credibility crisis in the midst of an equity crisis, from COVID, equity crisis because of the debt crisis, and because also of the financial process. So I think how Africa is going to emerge from this in shaping the agenda and bring their conditions, we're going to be seeing. There's a number of institutions that came out since Paris, since Durban, like, on the trade side. How are we going to use that to really, be, leading, some of the agenda instead of, following. So there's hope, but I think again, I totally appreciate Yuba and Fatima's appreciation, despite the fair share that Kevin highlighted, that we need more capacity mobilization, more consolidation of this African narrative and vision to create the leadership that we want to see. I am still hopeful, but yes, I think there's still some work to do.
Thanks, Yamid. I mean, one thing that's repeatedly being emphasized. I'll come to you, Kevin, in just a moment. Yeah, is this issue of capacity mobilization? This disconnect between knowledge and policy. Essentially, building the kind of evidence base to support, let's say, policy development and so forth. And this seems to be one of the areas that the CCG program is intending to do and working towards. I mean, Mark, is there something that you could offer here, to this conversation about how do we work on connecting the dots or pulling together the policy and the knowledge pieces? We'll come back to this question a bit later, but if there's any reflection for you, please.
Just to keep with the theme of the illustrious speakers that have spoken before me, and it really is humbling to be a part of this particular panel. As a student in Cape Town, I think I followed all of you, and it's a privilege to be able to be on the same platform. I think just to pick up on some of the thoughts that have gone before. I mean, I think it's helpful to remember that before COVID, African growth rates were really quite high. There's a lot of economic activity, African innovation, African solutions, and those continue. There are common markets developing and so on. And there's a huge amount of opportunity, and a lot of that is from the ground up. And I think that there's perhaps a lot more opportunity, and that opportunity can be through the whole climate process, and that opportunity can be harnessed, let's say, by moving quickly. And I do see an issue potentially with information and agency, the ability to have access to the right kind of tools to engage with really quite powerful players in different parts of the world quickly. Somebody spoke about Africa's resource is going to be needed for the so-called energy transition all over the world that everybody's talking about, which provides either a threat because Africa will be exploited as that is extracted, or a really large opportunity if it's the case that there is, as Yuba points out, a kind of African agenda that's led by good, solid local evidence with empowered decision makers. And so personally, I understand that it must be incredibly frustrating to sort of hear logos about not taking advantage of your resources and so on, because we have a climate crisis from countries that have, burnt their coal and their gas, and now looking for more gas and so on. And that must be difficult to swallow sometimes. I think on the other side that there's strong opportunity, and we need to get that information and knowledge mobilized. I want to point to something that the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa is leading at the moment, which is something called the Energy Modeling Platform for Africa. And this is in its 5th year at the moment. And I think they're really grappling a very difficult piece of the puzzle, which is to get that information that can be translated into investment strategies and so on, that are then directed by national policymakers and decision makers. So I think that's absolutely critical, and it's a bit of an uphill battle. I was involved with the folk when this was started up, and it was not a very popular thing at the time. It was something that was very Africa driven and led, and not necessarily looked upon well from the rest of the world. And I think that strongly has to change. I might offer one suggestion too, is apart from getting the information at hand to change this kind of knowledge asymmetry and power, which I think is really important. I think there's another important piece, and that is, I think that it would be there should be demands placed on the international community to be a little bit more client focused, let's say, with development funds, especially with respect to climate development funds. It is not easy to go from developing a national vision, translating that into good, hard, quantitative projects and programs, and then taking those projects and programs through to access concessionary financing and turning those into blended finance investments, and then realizing them. That is difficult. It is interesting that some countries have done an amazing job of this, and some of them are in Africa, but they have had to go through, and I know some of the analysts involved, they've jumped through a lot of hoops to get this working well. And I think it would be really judicious to attempt to get simplified, faster methodologies and a platform with success stories that accelerate some of the, on the one hand, learning between countries in Africa, because Africa is leading there's a lot of innovative finance that's ahead of the world in Africa, but that knowledge is localized on the one hand, and then on the other, a demand to the international community to simplify the processes and so on, because I think folk have been committing finance and resource, but it's getting access to that is still non-trivial. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. I mean, that's a nice segue to Kevin now. You led on this economic outlook report, and some of what Mark is talking about was very much featured in that report. As one of the chapters was on investment and finance. But just if you and also you're quite involved in the preparation for the COP, and having built strong relationship with the Egyptian presidency as well. I mean, what's your expectation, Kevin, for the COP? But also, if you could say a little bit about even though we will come back to that as well on a specific discussion on finance, why finance is not flowing, but at least to think about that as you respond about opportunities for the COP.
Okay, thank you very much, Jakob, and thank you, colleagues. Very many fundamental points has been raised here. Let me just elaborate on one. The linking science to policy, evidence to policy, is very crucial And it is why we embarked on the African Economic Outlook report, focusing on supporting climate resilience and a just energy transitions for Africa. In my many years of working in this sector, we seem to be going to these negotiations like barehanded. We don't have the facts. We don't have, proven facts with regards to what it means for Africa, energy transition. We've been talking about the development minerals in Africa, the opportunities it presents, what it means. We don't really know because the research intensity in this sector is not very high on the continent. And what we found in the Africa Economic Outlook report is shaping what I will personally want to see Africa ask for when it goes to the COP. The first one is that for us to comply with the NDCs that were agreed to as a condition for agreeing to the COP21 agreement, which one is the Paris COP agreement, you find that Africa needs up to 1.6 trillion US dollars between now and 2030. And Africa is currently receiving only 18.3 billion US dollars annually. That leaves a financing gap of over 118 billion US dollars annually. I'm quoting this figure because we remember that at the Paris Agreement, Africa's NDCs had 80% of those commitments as conditional on flow of foreign finance, climate finance coming into Africa. So when that climate finance is not coming into Africa, it then means that Africa is not capable of addressing or meeting the NDCs that was agreed to. And we are talking about 100 billion for the whole of the developing countries. That's what that agreement came with. And then you find that Africa alone needs more than that. And when you look at what Africa is receiving and the climate financing gap that there is, then it beholds on developed countries to actually restore trust in climate negotiations by actually meeting the barest minimum of that 100 billion. So for me, that is fundamental. And the argument of, we have fiscal constraints, we had COVID, we have Russia-Ukraine war, we had all these global headwinds that is making countries, shrinking the fiscal space of countries and making financing available for development, not really there. For me, it does not hold a lot of water. Reason because when we had a global challenge like COVID-19, the world mobilized over 17 trillion US dollars within 2 years to address a health pandemic. And for me, COVID-19, climate change impacts is worse than COVID-19, and it's also a global commons challenge. So the same way we rallied together to respond to that pandemic, we could rally together to respond to the challenges of climate change with regard to climate financing. Now, the second part of what I would say is that Africa should not be going to the COP and asking, I heard the word donors. So for me, this is not about donations. It's not about philanthropy. It's about decisions to save the world, to save the planet that we're all living on, not to save that planet. Because if you consider the point I've made already before with regard to the carbon budgets of the world, Africa has no reason to be constraining its development progress because of climate, because Africa is still within its carbon budget to meet net zero. But some other countries have really far outstripped that carbon budget. So when we can calculate the carbon credits of the world and the carbon debts of the world, Africa has huge carbon credits worth up to 4.8 trillion US dollars by 2050. So while other countries have a lot of carbon debt, so it's just like you have a debt to pay, so you can be considering yourself a donor because you are paying your debt. So because the other challenge is that if that debt is not paid, what if Africa decides to grow its economy within its carbon budget? It will increase the global carbon footprint, which will put the global climate in stress. So that discussion needs to happen. That's, for me, number one. Then the second point that Africa should look for in COP27, and these are my views, not the views of the African Development Bank Group, is that the discussion of the 100 billion needs to be revisited. Because having done this analysis, it becomes clear to me that 100 billion is a figure from nowhere. Because we cannot be asking for 100 billion for the whole of the developing countries, while only Africa, it needs 1.6 trillion, which is about 127 billion annually. So in that case, that discussion, maybe after 2025, we need to start at this COP27, that discussion on what is the actual climate finance flows that is required for different countries in the world to be able to reach the net zero that we've talked about. But again, Jakob, you started off by talking about loss and damage. It's also a discussion that we need to have at the COP. Technology transfer, capacity building, and so on has always been on the table. But then you find that the technology transfer models we're using in that discussion just mirrors the global aid architecture. And that has not been effective in addressing poverty. It will not be effective in addressing climate change. So we need to think very innovatively as Africans. That's what Fatima was saying. What is our narrative? Are we going as we are begging for resources, or are we asking for what is our due within the carbon budget of the world? So we need to think through all those things very carefully as we move forward to address these global commons challenges that we have. Because the Paris Agreement, why I love that agreement is that it laid the rubrics for justice and equity, common but differentiated responsibilities, technology transfers and knowledge transfers. All these things we're discussing about were actually covered in the Paris Climate Agreement. But the implementation of that Paris Climate Agreement has been the challenge. So my personal frustration with COPs is that we seem to be rediscussing issues and not focusing on it, because the agreements are not really binding, legally binding on countries. So there are no consequences for not following it. So we keep rediscussing the same issues over and over for 27 years, while the climate challenge is continuing to grow and poverty is deepening on the continent. So climate justice and just energy transitions will therefore require that Africa has clarity, and I will say clear-eyed, with regard to what it's actually looking for. The next thing is what Yoba said. We need to go with tangible projects, things that we can do within that environment that we have to harness our own development minerals, which a lot of it is in Africa. In all forms of the green transitions, where I see a lot of economic development competitiveness for Africa to build its own markets. We have the ACFTA that can allow us to actually benefit from those. But my fear is that we'll continue supplying raw materials to the rest of the world and buying finished products, as we have been doing in the former industrial transformation and industrial transitions. And if we do that, the carbon footprint of those products will still make even green products not green. So for Africa and the rest of the world to industrialize, green industrialization within Africa is something that needs to be pushed for. So there are a lot of economic, structural, macroeconomic, technology, trade, different forms of things that we need to really know what it means for Africa and how we engage in that discussion, and not going as if people are going to do us a favor, because 27 years of that type of discussion has not led to so much for the continent. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. Fatima, it looks like Kevin is speaking your language of Africa's narrative.
Yeah, very much so. We're kindred spirits. So it's great, great to see Kevin and great to hear him as well. No, I mean, that was just such a very, very eloquent way of, I'd say, comprehensively looking at some of the things that need to be done, some of the things that need to be negotiated. or rethought, I would say. But I wanted to start from a point that that Kevin mentioned, and he said something to the effect of there's no reason for Africa to constrain, its development on the basis of the emissions that we're producing, given our very low carbon footprint. And I basically want to say that this constraining capacity that Kevin mentioned is a lot higher on the other side. It's a lot higher on the other side because, Yuba has a tendency to say, this is a continent. I think even the word transition doesn't quite apply. What are we transitioning to? What does transition mean? If transition means conversion, that's not Africa, because right now, countries in mature economies need to transition from where they are to moving towards a low carbon development. I mean, Yuba always says this very clearly. We've been stuck on an energy ladder for such a long time, and yes, we've made a number of very good improvements, and some would argue in terms of our ability to deploy renewable energy sources, not just in terms of what we have, but what we're able to deploy. So I think the transition, we need to ask ourselves the what and the how and where of the transition. We need to go to another point that Kevin made, which I think is so critical. And that's EU has got a Green Deal, right? And they have a Green Deal because they have a mitigation ambition. They have an ambition towards how they reduce their carbon footprint. And they have some aspects of the Green Deal that could cause problems for Africa. They have the carbon border adjustment mechanism, where they will tax countries that have evidence of wanting to export goods from very carbon intensive industries to the EU or to EU market, what they call carbon leakage. And what is Africa's plan? When and especially since some of these taxes is not actually warranted, because Africa doesn't produce that much steel, doesn't produce that much cement. So how is Africa going to respond to those kind of potential penalties that would be applied, that EU would apply? The second point or third point, still based on Kevin's very recent argument, is the point that he made. If Africa decided that it will take advantage of its resources, and it will take advantage of these resources irrespective of a carbon budget that has shrunken to nothingness for Africa, then the rest of the world will not be able to, EU in particular, may not be able to carry on with its mitigation ambition of 2050. Certainly not, because what happens in one part of the world has an impact on the other part of the world. Africa is paying for negative externalities already. And I think when we talk about just transition, and I know we're going to get to that conversation, it's not just a just transition in terms of jobs loss. I think it's more than that. It's just transition also in terms of the fact that the capacity and our ability to transition is already layered and superimposed by so many other difficulties and challenges. The challenges of managing a broken economy, the challenges of restructuring the economy, the challenges of managing high debt, managing fiscal loss, managing revenue loss, and all of those different types of management to move then. I mean, it's almost like you're starting a race. The others have actually got to the finish line and you're still at starter's block because you can't even get off the point of running, but others have actually gotten to a stage where they're far advanced in the race and you're really where you are. And let's just consider this point. Africa is perhaps the only continent that has been asked, right? And it's been asked, and I always use that word cautiously because the sense is that we have renewable energy resources to abundance, but it's the only continent that is supposedly going to work towards growth, right? Towards a low carbon development. And to do that without your fossil fuels, the resources that others took advantage of. fossil fuels has been what fueled the economies of mature economies. And it seems like Africa's been asked in many ways to go towards this development without the resources that others had taken advantage of. So I think that there are tremendous aspects of injustice in this conversation. I mean, in the narrative as it is now, and implicitly, I think Kevin was talking about preparation, or explicitly, but preparation is key here, because if Africa doesn't prepare itself, then it would be a circular conversation again of taking some of the big issues but not getting any results, the climate finance, the means of implementation issues on capacity, etc. Somebody mentioned the development minerals, the green minerals. We can't deploy the scale of renewable energies that we want to deploy without those green minerals. They are absolutely fundamental. We did a study where we said 46 out of the 66 minerals that Africa that are needed for a fourth industrial revolution are already home to Africa. But I think we need to, if we have to transition, we need to transition from saying we own something to actually actualizing that ownership. It's not enough to own something. We have to actualize it in terms of markets, how we bring those markets together, how we make sure those markets work for us, how we not, I mean, if countries are now coming and they're paying for Africa to really source hydrogen. And as I said before, you're sourcing hydrogen, and then that hydrogen is not supporting your energy gap. What is the point? So there are fundamental injustices, and it's not all down to a mean old West doing some things that are not quite right. No, it's actually a governance and a leadership within African countries itself, or themselves, that we need to correct, So it's not about and I think Mark mentioned the word symmetry. I absolutely agree. There's an asymmetrical power relations here, but it's beyond that also. African countries also have to do things for themselves, for their people. And I'll just finish with this very quickly, Jakob. I just had read a story the other day whereby, because of the potential that Mozambique has in terms of gas reserves, and because of the energy anxiety, the EU is looking for other suppliers, and Mozambique seems to be a very good alternative. But let's appreciate this for a minute. And I thought I had the figure here. Mozambique, the EU has already given 89 million euros to Mozambican government in terms of ensuring that, because the gas reserves where they are is very close to some Islamic or Islamist group, and so they want to protect the source of gas so that the Islamist group doesn't lay hands on that gas. So suddenly 89 million appears, 15 million to SADC, to Mozambique to fight the insurgency, because that gas should not be controlled by the wrong people. But I'm saying, if these monies are there, where was it before? Why don't we enable those countries so that they can build the infrastructure that they want and work towards a managed exit? Because let's make no mistake, Africa has to become greener. It's already green, it has to become greener, because there are many reasons why green development is is going to benefit us. We can't knock it down, or we can't play that down. It's important. But how do we do it when we see all of these, as Yamid was saying, the double standard, the double speak, they actually counterproductive to a climate action debate, especially as we're working towards COP. So essentially, I would say, let Africa go with a plan on what it needs to do on natural gas. Let it go with a plan on how it's going to protect itself when stranded assets happen. Let it go with a plan on not just talking about climate finance, ad infinitum, without significant meaning of what that finance would mean. These are all things that we have to put in place. But we can't go, as Kevin said, asking for donation. We now have to look at the problem the other way around. Africa can lead in a green development. Africa can be the continent that shapes the direction of travel. So we need to assume that role.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Fatima. Tour de force of a very strong argument and bringing in the justice issue. Before I turn to Yuba and Mark, let me come to you, Yamid. I think the question around power and justice, equity, is forever inscribed in our climate related conversation. I mean, what's your reaction to, not reaction, but also what's your view about how you see this, just transition issue sort of playing out in at the service of Africa, of course?
Well, thank you. It's difficult to come after Kevin and Fatima, who alluded to the justice elements, and it's connected to what we're going to see also at the COP. We're supposed to shift from normative design to implementation. So I think again, it's we need to see this as an opportunity to really unpack and discuss, pragmatically some of those issues. And that means that signals at this COP will not just come from the negotiations, but also from, some of those roundtable discussions that the presidency will organize, including on just energy transition, from initiative, from any pledges or conversation happening outside, what will be showcased from outside and from what is happening on the ground. When it comes to the just energy transition, I think Fatima said it, there's been a lot of focus on the job narrative, when it comes to the justice element, and not enough, in the way to look into the externalities, beyond climate, and also in the process. There's, the outcome, but there's also the how, and how to make sure that, those conversations happen in a participatory way, that, the youth, the women, or the vulnerable communities are on the table, that we don't remain necessarily at national level, but regional level. And for me, the just transition is not just also about reducing emission. It's not just about energy transition. I think the IPCC, the latest 2 IPCC report made it clear we need to look at it in a decided way, and we need to look also in parallel at the same time the resilience issue, how to transition towards more resilient societies. And sorry, and I think when it comes to the resilience, or to how to deal with impacts, this is where you have the impacts of climate change, but also the impacts of unintended impacts of climate measures that were also, looked into. And I will give you an example of, one issue that is, looked into, the loss and damage being, which is going to be a major, maybe make or breaker of this COP. There's a lot of attention to this. It's about forced displacement, and I prefer to use the term climate mobility. But you see, if you look at the just energy transition in South Africa, and the fact that you would have to displace community of miners, to a different region, than Mpumalanga, to the northern part, of Cape, you have displacement created, even with, when it comes to some mitigation, decisions. And on top of that, you have all those displacement created because of the impacts of climate change. And this is where you cannot look at it just from also a financial point of view, but also what would need to be the legal empowerment, legal protection, health, any safety nets, and therefore what needs to be the mechanism, both financial, but beyond finance, at both international and national level, to make sure that the vulnerable communities, are not affected again the most, by those transitions. But I'm sure that our other panelists will look into this. But I think this COP And also outside the negotiation, there's going to be opportunity to discuss those issues, hopefully in depth, because we are in this implementation stage. The other thing that I would like to say when it comes to just transition is how to make sure that the finance mobilized is also more sustainable. It's also more accessible. I totally agree with Kevin that, you know, this 100 billion has just been a political agreement with no evidence base. And what we need to discuss is really how to get the trillions and how to get them where it is needed the most. So that, you know, accessibility, that the issue of access and in the mobilization needs to be looked into, you know, also out of the box way for the continent, how to also bring not just the international financial usual suspects, but also, you know, the private sector from the continents. And it may be a little bit messy, but for the first time, I think there's going to be more conversation among the diaspora at this COP, you know, trying to look at, you know, how to use, you know, those, you know, different strengths, you know, of, you know, the African continent and its descendants. So I think there's going to be opportunities to look into those just elements, but yes, but not just, you know, from an energy point of view, but also when it comes to resilience on adaptation and loss and damage as well.
Thank you, Yamid. I mean, that really takes us into the issue of the role that knowledge institutions can play in terms of building the evidence for what Fatima and Kevin have been talking about in terms of the kind of the broader sort of justice questions at the global level, but then also what Yamid, you're talking about in terms of looking deeper within let's say a country or so, and making sure that the transition is just and does not have those consequences on vulnerable communities who are already vulnerable, in other words. I mean, so I think, I mean, let me turn to you, Mark and Yuba. Of course, all of us operate, you know, within this space of knowledge creation and knowledge dissemination, etc. But what would be the role, for example, the CCG program, Mark, in terms of, you know, creating that evidence, which has, you know, justice issues inscribed both at the global level in terms of how countries relate to each other and the justice question embedded in that, but also at country level. So let's say, you know, flows of 1.6 trillion US dollars happens, how that is going to be distributed, and what is the role that research institutions can play in creating the knowledge to be able to create the kind of you know, investment possibilities for that.
No, thank you very much for the question, Jakob. And I think, you know, there are two parts to this. Actually, the first part, I think, is very much around institutions and knowledge generating organizations building trust and co-creating the research agenda that needs to take place. So I'm very conscious CCG's an unusual program in that, you know, we have a set of core UK-based universities, but a very large proportion of the information and other things that are generated by or with partners in regions. So, and I think that's important. The questions that are being asked and generated need to be completely relevant for a program like CCG, which is a partnership-focused program. I think to answer the question, there are a number of different things. The first is that there are sort of relatively important strategic planning tools that are not ubiquitously owned and applied throughout African governments and universities and so on. Often it's the case that if somebody's developing a strategic national plan, an external consultant will be flown in, perhaps with local government money, perhaps with external money and so on. They'll develop a study and then move on. And I think it's absolutely essential that building on efforts that Yuba's been instrumental in putting in place, Linus Morfor and Fatima have put in place with the African modeling platform and so on, is absolutely critical to get that information into universities and into planning departments in governments really fast. And I think creating an ecosystem that supports that to ensure that it's self-sustaining and African-driven to meet an African agenda is important. CCG is doing a number of things together with a number of partners, and very close collaboration, both sort of bilaterally with the FCDO who sponsor the program and governments, but importantly also at sort of university and practitioner level. We've jointly created online material for how to run energy models, how to set up integrated assessment models, and so on. So these are accessible. The platforms that we're supporting through UNECA are training, close to 100 African analysts per year, setting up communities, again, in partnership. We're often not driving these, we're helping to enable those, so that there's exchange of substantial info to provide the insights that are required that allow us to tackle the sort of knowledge and information asymmetry. And I think it's critical to do this fast, because we have the technologies now to ensure that the information, data, and insights are transparent and so on. So I think that allows for greater collaboration, cooperation, quicker, and to do this in a way that is self-sustained, I think is important. And we're working in CCG, we're working very much on the evidence creation and so on that helps empower the decision makers. We're not about making those decisions or creating lobbies and so on, but one could imagine, for example, this information being used to allow Africa to systematically understand the value of the resources, for example, that it has right now in terms of the global transition, and the leverage that's potentially there because of that, to turn this into a different type of conversation, as has been mentioned by many of the speakers. But CCG is a program that's focused on generating independent, open knowledge that's accessible with support, that can be taken up and run with by African thought leaders. I want to just end off with one thing. If you look at, I edit a journal called Energy Strategy Reviews. I've been in the space of energy modeling, which is kind of a core strategic piece of this puzzle for a long time, and it's been really heartening. In the last year, we've seen African academics basically, just move the envelope and develop special issues that have advanced planning and a set of other things driven by an African agenda. There'll be a special issue coming out now, and it's humbling, in part because this is something that we're allowed to be a part of and partner with, and we're grateful for that, but also that it really does stand on the shoulder of giants. Yuba, I mention Yuba a lot because I remember him being very influential when I was a student, just thinking about trying to get this information available so that folk were empowered to lead this. And a number of other initiatives dotted around that have been difficult to start up. So it's very nice to be able to connect and help build those. And we're really keen to engage as well. So if there are things that folk can see as important gaps in academia or knowledge creation or so on, and they're keen to work in partnership, we would love to explore those. Thanks.
Thank you, Mark. Yeah, I mean, Yuba, you often talk about building institutions, mainly knowledge institutions at the service of policy and practice, and I know that you've been this has been one of your frustrations. I guess my question is, a lot has been discussed so far. I mean, we can continue for another several hours in trying to unpack, what we've discussed so far. what has been, in your view, some of the real challenge in building credible institutions that are able to think on their feet across Africa? I mean, in a sense, where does your frustration come from when it comes to the whole question of institution building? And here we're talking about institutions, not just, buildings, or but rather, even the very ideas and the laws, the codified pieces of knowledge, and so forth.
Yeah, I think that, Jacob, is not fair to put on the same panel Mark, Fatima, Yamid, and Kevin, and asking me to speak the later, and then they will take all what I have in mind. And it's not at all fair. I think that I wish this discussion we are having took place at AMSEN in Dakar. I was there. Unfortunately, this discussion never happened. I wish this discussion could happen with a meeting of climate negotiators. It never happened. Let me start by, there is an irony the African does not realize. It's the African who are funding the adaptation actually in Africa. Because there is a huge difference between mitigation and adaptation. Mitigation, you can wait. You can say, I'm not mitigating, I'm not doing any action. Adaptation, you have no choice. Because any African country, drought-prone areas or flooding areas, they have to do something about it. And then if they are building infrastructure, and then implicitly they will consider the climate issues. The point is not, we have not documented it. We even have not think about it. You said adaptation. The problem is that there is a limit of adaptation, and in many areas, we reach the limit of what can be adapted to. And then some mention loss and damage. Here again, we have seen even within this 3 months period, a lot of loss and damages by flooding in the Sahel. This is not documented. And the biggest problem is that we have all the resources, we have all the means, and then to put together a credible institution to tackle those different issues. We even do not need to have it physically. Just give you one example. During the past 2 months, we put together a number of African scholars, about more than 40 different scholars in Africa, and then to produce a paper on some of the fundamental issue on energy in the continent. And that will be published by Nature maybe next week. And then this is a kind of mechanism we can put together. But we did it as academics, as researchers. And then the problem is that how to make that link with the policymaker, policy arena, and then that's a big problem. And then how to make that link with some of the regional institutional organizations, and such as the African Development Bank, such as the Union, and so on and so forth. And in the various IPCC reports, it's clearly indicated that there is a trade-off between climate mitigation and alleviating poverty, between climate mitigation and sustainable development. At the same time, it clearly indicated they can go hand in hand. There is a lot of synergy, but where are the evidence in the African context of those different elements? Because per se, we have nothing to mitigate, but we do have to alleviate poverty, and how it is not possible to link with the climate. Those are some of the fundamental elements, and then we need to work on, but that need to be, that need to be linked to the policy making institutions. And this is really what is lacking. In the beginning, I said that there is a link between policy science and practice. And then those mechanisms, and actually we can do it in a very flexible way. And then to create a platform of organization, and then Mark indicated that, and then that can be easily, and then to see how that can be supported at the policy level. So there is a lot to do, and there is a lot where we can do, and then we have to start working on those different issues. Not saying, and then we have to ban the use of, the transition. It does not mean anything, or we have to clearly articulate what we mean by transition. In the case of indigenous country, we know exactly why they need to do transition. Why in the African case we need to build our system. We said that we have to build a transition. The area we need to make the transition, we are not doing it. This is firewood and charcoal. In Nairobi, 81, 40 years later on, everybody forget about it. And then just devastating the continent. And then those are some of the fundamental issues we are not taking on board. Okay, we can spend all the afternoon talking about it. I saw also some of the participants, they want to talk and then they want to come in. Back to you.
Thanks, Yuba. Kevin, over to you. Before, I think, we're going to have to, wind down soon, but let me come to you quickly and then one more round for each. There are lots of questions, of course, but what we can promise at this stage is that we will all these questions, and they will be very useful in sharpening some of the side events that we are organizing. And so, please follow what we're doing over the course of the next month, and so that we engage you in the conversation. The hour and a half is kind of limited to bring in others, but a lot of, some of the questions I'm asking are also related to what others have been putting in the chat. Kevin.
Okay, yeah, mine is just to thank you again and thank colleagues and delegates for, participants in this discussion. I think we need to have these types of discussions more often. And the points that's been raised by Yuba and so on, Jacob, the African Development Bank, following the report that I've just talked about, has been discussing developing a book volume on climate for development in Africa. So I will be coming back to all the panelists and all the delegates. Let's get all our bright ideas together and start shaping that dialogue for the continent. And then, Yoba, the idea that you raised here in terms of having like a virtual network of climate scientists in Africa, climate economists and so on. Let's talk more about that, because the African Development Institute is really keen on mobilizing Africa's expertise and expertise on Africa to bring it to bear to major development questions and challenges. And as you know, climate, I wanted to say climate transitions, but Yuba is here, so I will ban the word transitions. Climate change and just energy, just access to energy are very critical in the things that the bank is currently focusing on. So I'll be happy to discuss further on how to operationalize some of the key outcomes of this great panel discussion. And with that, I will have to excuse myself because I have another meeting that I need to run to here at the World Bank annual meetings.
But use the word jump starting instead of transition.
We have to jumpstart development, resilient growth in Africa. Okay.
Thank you, Kevin, and we'll talk more about the way forward. Definitely.
Thank you so much.
Yeah,
thank you so much. Bye, colleague.
Thanks a lot. Just one little question to each of us. I was in communications with some of the Egyptian team. Unfortunately, none of them were able to come, but they have asked for what is it that we recommend to, in COP27 in terms of what Egypt, should be carrying forward. So it's a question to all of us. What should be achieved in this coming COP? Any thoughts? Quick ones, quick fire.
To set up African agenda.
All right.
To bridge the climate financing gap.
To create a transparent toolkit.
All right. All right. Fatima?
To think about strategic use of the resources, especially natural gas.
All right. Yamid?
Well, I think the capacity mobilization is to be there, but when it comes to the second for me is changing our approach and the reform of the financial system. Let's make sure that at this COP we don't agree for a 3-year program to do something, to have talks. Timing is important. It's not about charity donations. So and we can call for a mosaic approach of things because there's evidence that it can be differently. So yeah.
Thank you.
Trust.
Yes, I agree. Trust.
Okay. Trust. Okay, thank you, colleagues.
We will package it and send it to them. So thank you, Kevin. And well, let me thank all of you, the panelists, for this interesting conversation. We've only scratched the surface, to be quite frank. This was a really enjoyable and inspiring also discussion. But also thank you to. Let me also thank some colleagues who have worked really hard to make this webinar happen. I mean, first of all, Simon Patterson, our comms colleague, who's constantly reminding us to get our act, together, get our message right, and so forth. Sarel, for his work on content, graphics, Emma, all this getting shit done, let's say. Lucas, deep understanding about process and delicate messaging. Sarah, for being the engine room in preparation of our COP work. And of course, Steffi also for handling a lot of the side events that will be coming up in a few weeks' time. So, and also, I mean, the rest of you, those who've stayed with us for the duration of this side event, thank you so much. But again, panelists, Fatima, Yamid, Yuba, Mark, and Kevin, we will keep this conversation going, and we will shape our side events also based on some of the wonderful insights that we've gained. We hope we can count on you as speakers or panelists in November. Yeah. So
thank you very much.
Great show, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Jakob, for the invitation.
Indeed.
And a wonderful job.
Indeed, I agree. See you soon.
Have a great day, everyone. Thank you.